Good morning again. We're going to try again live from Medora, North Dakota. I'll hope that whatever technical difficulties I've had briefly this morning, that they don't replicate themselves. But if need be, if we get cut off, I think what I'll do is I'll video record today's message and post that later. Hopefully the connection stays, in which case I hope that you might have heard me start with a wish for a happy 90th birthday to Dean Patterson, Brown Patterson, William Brown Patterson of Sewanee, Tennessee, born this day, April 8th, 1930. Brown Patterson and his wife Evie were the first couple of the Gamma Chi chapter of Beta Theta Pi, a chapter that Brown was a founding member of before he graduated Sewanee in 1952. Took his Rhodes Scholarship to England, studied there under C.S. Lewis. Brown is an accomplished author on the Reformation of the Church in England and an inspiration to so many of us. And Evie, one of the dearest, kindest ladies, they stalwarts, cornerstones of St. Odie's Parish in Sewanee, Tennessee. Happy birthday, Brown Patterson. April 8th, 1869, 151 years ago today, New York Governor John Thompson Hoffman signed legislation creating the American Museum of Natural History, at least providing the backing of the state of New York and its finances and chartering for the museum. The museum had its origin in great part from Theodore Roosevelt's father, Theodore Roosevelt, who with others helped to push for the adoption of that vision of that museum. The charter for that museum said to be signed in the living room at the Roosevelt family home, and a Roosevelt family member on the board of the American Museum of Natural History since its inception. You can find in its deepest chasms some birds' eggs and mice skeletons donated by Theodore Roosevelt. And of course, during Cousin Franklin's gubernatorial administration, the American Museum of Natural History, its great eastern edifice and great welcoming hall, are the official New York State memorials to that man who is remembered outside with a beautiful equestrian statue and words like statesman, explorer, soldier. It's a wonderful place to visit. If you get to New York City, go to Central Park and visit the American Museum of Natural History, celebrating today its 151st birthday. On the north side of that park, of that museum, a little park called Roosevelt Park, and named for Theodore Roosevelt, and as well land for the museum donated in part by the family of Theodore Roosevelt. On this date, April 8th, 1913, the Congress ratified the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. This provided for the popular election of senators rather than what had been in effect since the founding, the election of those senators, two from each state, by the state legislatures of each of the states. So it's interesting to note that for the 7.5 years that Theodore Roosevelt was our president, he was dealing with the United States Senate full of allies like Henry Cabot Lodge or Senator Beveridge of Indiana, and full of opponents. Senator Thomas Collier Platt, previous to his presidency, Senator Ben Pitchfork Tillman of South Carolina, a point of our remarks later this morning. Those senators were all sent by the state legislatures during Teddy's presidency. I may have to correct myself if other states had adopted more liberal direct voting for the senators. Isn't it wonderful to study history's mysteries? And for me, another point of personal privilege started with happy 90th birthday to Brown Patterson. On this date in 1974, when I was a little shaver attending Salt Creek Elementary School in Elmhurst, Illinois, I remember when Hank Aaron took the Los Angeles Dodgers pitcher Al Downing deep for number 715. And as a young boy coming through that era, to see Hank Aaron and all that he represented break the record of the Bambino of Babe Ruth with that home run without the aid of any steroids at all, I'm sure. It was a great moment for the country, I think. Well, here's to baseball eventually being played. I was lamenting, just think how many times the national anthem hasn't been sung this spring. Today, a salute from Theodore Roosevelt to the Palmetto State, South Carolina, of course, rich in the history of this country, and as well a place where the Great Schism of 1861 through 65 began with the bombing of Fort Sumter to launch the Civil War in April of 1861. Theodore Roosevelt's roots on his mother's side were deep in the South, famously in Roswell, Georgia, and Savannah, Georgia. But as the president alludes, for a century previous to being Georgians, the family were South Carolinians. Famous was a story of the Scots Presbyterian minister returning from the failed colony of Darien, what would someday be Panama, headed back to Scotland, but stopping in Charleston, the Reverend and his wife and daughter being hailed on shore to preach a sermon to the local Scots Presbyterian church. And when the minister and his family were on shore, a hurricane came through Charleston Harbor, destroyed the small Scottish fleet that was returning the colonists to Scotland, and that family stayed in South Carolina. And Theodore Roosevelt is descendant from those South Carolinian Scots Presbyterians in part. 1902 saw Charleston, and late 1901 as well, saw Charleston hosting the South Carolina Interstate and West Indian Exposition. This is in the spirit of the great Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. Previous expositions in Philadelphia, Paris, I believe, was held prior to that date. And it was thought this is a great injection of inspiration, of course, coming just after the exposition, the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, so crucial to the history of Theodore Roosevelt. The idea of infusing the community with tourists and showing off the great inventions, not only of the state, but of other states and communities. Fascinating history of the exposition in 1902. Theodore Roosevelt was invited and accepted the invitation to attend. He made remarks on the evening of April 8th, 1902. He will include remarks here that mention the mayor, and the mayor is James Adger Smith. He himself, the son of a Presbyterian pastor and a graduate of Charleston College. The man alluded to later in Theodore Roosevelt's remarks, Hugh Thompson. He refers to him as your former governor. Hugh Thompson, of course, a Democrat, elected to 2 terms as the South Carolina governor in 1882 and 1884. In 1886, he was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Treasury Department by the Democratic Governor Grover Cleveland. Cleveland had been governor of New York when young Theodore Roosevelt was an assemblyman. Cleveland, of course, is counted as our 22nd and 24th president, having served non-consecutive terms. So it was during his first term that Thompson was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. In 1889, he was appointed by President Benjamin Harrison, the Republican from Indiana, to be a member of the United States Civil Service Commission, which was created under the Pendleton Act, named for Congressman George Pendleton of Ohio. And that same year, 1889, that Benjamin Harrison appointed Governor Thompson to be a member of the United States Civil Service Commission, young Theodore Roosevelt was also appointed to that commission, a commission which he would hold for nearly, or the greater part of 7 years, serving in that position nearly as long as he served as President of the United States. The speeches that are made briefly on the evening of April 8th and then at greater length on April 9th, this is wonderfully insightful for some of you that have written to me about the appeal of the interest you have in the Civil War. And this is sort of the reconciliation of the country decades after the Civil War that Theodore Roosevelt addresses in his remarks. So thank you for your joining this morning, and thank you for your patience as I both make some comments and then do the reading. Teddy Talks is so named because I thought it important that we actually hear what Theodore Roosevelt said in the day. I love doing my entertainments, but they are a mixture of storytelling and, like Theodore Roosevelt, my cowboy historians assure me, he liked to embellish a story as well. So, but I'd like to stick to the facts as TR would have stuck to them in his remarks. So, April 8th, 1902, and this is in Charleston, South Carolina. Mr. Mayor, and you, my hosts, and my fellow American citizens, I should indeed be but a poor American myself if I were not deeply touched and gratified by the way you have greeted me today in this your beautiful city. And of course, I feel at home here. I think that an American who is worth his salt has the right to feel at home in every part of the United States. Around this table, I see many men who took part in the great wars. The war in which the younger among us here took part was a very little one because it didn't have to be any bigger. But it had one thoroughly good effect. It put the cap on the structure that had been building while we were almost unconscious of it. And it taught us how thoroughly at one we were. When we got through the war, it did not make a bit of difference to us whether it was an admiral who came from Vermont or a lieutenant who came from Alabama, if the man had done his duty in such shape as to make us each feel an even more generous thrill of pride in our common nationality. The debt that we owed him had little to do with the section from which he came. And now a special word to you of Charleston and of South Carolina. Just 12 years ago, when I first went to Washington to take part in governmental work, I was immediately thrown into singularly close contact and intimacy with a South Carolinian. It was my good fortune to work with him for 3 years and for the 9 years since, and for as long as I shall continue to be in public life. It will be to me ever a spur to try to do decent duty for the Republic, because I have been thrown intimately in contact with as fearless and as high-minded a public servant as this country has ever had, my old friend, your former governor, Hugh Thompson. And from what I have known of you and of your representatives, it was in no sense a surprise, but it was a keen pleasure to be greeted with the hearty and generous hospitality, the more than hearty and generous hospitality, which you have shown me today. The welfare of any part of this country is, in a certain sense, an index of the welfare of all. And I think, gentlemen, that on average, as we all tend to go up, it seems to be a little better to go up uniformly rather than at a sharper gait for the time being, and then down, and then up again, and then down. South Carolina seems during the last 2 decades to have definitely entered upon the path of steady progress in things material as well as in other things. I was much struck in looking over some figures of the census quite recently, published, to see that the astonishing progress that has been made here in your state. I was prepared to see that the values of your farm products had risen as they have, a little over 25%. I was prepared to see that your farms themselves had increased in a still larger proportion, that the value of your lands and buildings had grown up, but I did not realize the way in which your manufacturing enterprises had increased, both as shown in the fact that your manufacturing products had gone up over 230%, that, for instance, the number of spindles had about quadrupled, from less than 500,000 to more than 2 million in the state. I did not realize that the wages paid out had increased 75%. Gentlemen, you talk of the progress of the far West, but I think South Carolina can give points to some of the states. I think that with such a record for the previous decade, you were well warranted upon insisting on holding your exposition here. And gentlemen, I was very glad that in arranging for your exposition, you not only took in the southern states, but that you specifically included the islands lying south of the United States. Those islands with which events of the last few years have made it evident that we are bound in the future to have closer relations. Closer relation for our advantage also. And about all that I have said applies to the greatest and richest of those islands, the island with which we have been brought in the most peculiar intimacy and relationship with, the island of Cuba. And I ask that in our trade relations with Cuba, we give her a marked and substantial advantage, not mainly, because it will redound to our interest to do so, although that is also true. But I ask it especially because events have so shaped themselves that it is our duty as a great and mighty nation to help Cuba, and I hope to see us do our duty. I shall not try to make you any speech tonight, because for your sins you will have to listen to one tomorrow. I shall surely thank you again with all my heart, and say to you that I want you to appreciate that I mean every word I say, and mean it deeply, when I tell you I have been touched, more than pleased, touched, and stirred by the warmth and heartiness with which you have made me feel today that I am one of you. Those are banquet remarks, and I love the inclusion of references. I'm thinking that Governor Hugh Thompson was in the audience that night, and there was probably applause from his fellow South Carolinians and guests from throughout the country. The remarks the following day at the Charleston Exposition, the South Carolina Interstate and West Indies Exposition, it began late in 1901. It was as challenged, or more so, than any other exposition that's been held. There are normally big affairs that lose money. There's controversy. Very often contractors seeking funds from the exposition committee that's low on funds because they didn't sell as many admission tickets as they thought, those sorts of things. The exposition in South Carolina certainly would not have happened without the leadership of Frederick Wagoner. Wagoner was a German immigrant, a shopkeeper, would go on to be a leading businessman as a grocery wholesaler. He had fought with a regiment of German South Carolinians led by his brother, J.A. Wagoner, a 1871 elected as mayor of Charleston, South Carolina. Quite an interesting history of the German community in Charleston and beyond. So committed to the cause was Wagoner that he sold his estate on the peninsula to the state of South Carolina, or to the city of Charleston, if I correct myself. Today, that's both Hampton Park on the east side of those grounds and the Citadel, the South Carolina Military Institute. Both comprise the old grounds of what were Wagoner's home plantation, but then also his, though he owned no slaves, his brother owned one during the war. Wagoner's land, he was paid $25,000. His Lawns Grove, or the Grove Farm home in which he lived, actually became the Women's Building at the South Carolina Exposition and stands today. So that's when he says, Mr. President, Theodore Roosevelt is referring to the president of the exposition, Mr. Wagoner. The mayor is the mayor of South Carolina. I thought I had note of his name. Well, we'll go on and let the president speak for himself. A bit of a longer speech at the exposition. Thanks for your patience this morning. Theodore Roosevelt, April 9th, 1902, in Charleston, South Carolina. Mr. President, Mr. Mayor, you, the men and women of the Palmetto State, men and women of the South, my fellow citizens of the Union, it is indeed to me a peculiar pleasure to have the chance of coming here to this exposition held in your old, your beautiful, your historic city. My mother's people were from Georgia, but before they came to Georgia, before the Revolution, in the days of colonial rule, they dwelt for nearly a century in South Carolina, and therefore I can claim your state as mine by inheritance, no less than by the stronger and nobler right which makes each foot of American soil in sense the property of all Americans. Charleston is not only a typical Southern city, it is also a city whose history teems with events which link themselves to American history as a whole. In the early colonial days, Charleston was the outpost of our people against the Spaniard in the South. In the days of the Revolution, there occurred here some of the events which vitally affected the outcome of the struggle for independence and which impressed themselves most deeply upon the popular mind. It was here that the tremendous, terrible drama of the Civil War opened. With delicate and thoughtful courtesy, you originally asked me to come to this exposition on the birthday of Abraham Lincoln. The invitation not only showed a fine generosity and manliness in you, my hosts, but it also emphasized, as hardly anything else could have emphasized, how completely we are now a united people. The wounds left by the great Civil War, incomparably the greatest war of modern times, have healed, and its memories are now priceless heritages of honor alike to the North and to the South. The devotion, the self-sacrifice, the steadfast resolution and lofty daring, the high devotion to the right as each man saw it, whether Northerner or Southerner, all these qualities of the men and women of the early 60s now shine luminous and brilliant before our eyes, while the mists of anger and hatred that once dimmed them have passed away forever. All of us, North and South, can glory alike in the valor of the men who wore the blue and of the men who wore the gray. Those were iron times, and only iron men could fight to its terrible finish the giant struggle between the hosts of Grant and Lee, the struggle that came to an end 37 years ago this very day. To us of the present day, and to our children and children's children, the valiant deeds, the high endeavor, and abnegation of self shown in that struggle by those who took part therein will remain forevermore to mark the level to which we in our turn must rise whenever the hour of the nation's need may come. When 4 years ago this nation was compelled to face a foreign foe, the completeness of the reunion became instantly and strikingly evident. The war was not one which called for the exercise of more than an insignificant fraction of our strength, and the strain put upon us was slight indeed compared with the results. But it was a satisfactory thing to see the way in which the sons of the soldier of the Union and the soldier of the Confederacy leapt eagerly forward, emulous to show in brotherly rivalry the qualities which had won renown for their fathers, the men of the Great War. It was my good fortune to serve under an ex-Confederate general, gallant old Joe Wiegand, who commanded the cavalry division at Santiago. In my regiment, there were certainly as many men whose fathers had served in the Southern as there were men whose father had served in the Northern Army. Among the captains, there was opportunity to promote but one to field rank. The man who was singled out for this promotion because of conspicuous gallantry in the field was the son of a Confederate general and was himself a citizen of this, the Palmetto State. And no American officer could wish to march to battle beside a more loyal, gallant, and absolutely fearless comrade than my former captain and major, your fellow citizen, Micah Jenkins. A few months ago, owing to the enforced absence of the governor of the Philippines, it became necessary to nominate a vice governor to take his place, one of the most important places in our government at this time. I nominated as vice governor an ex-Confederate, General Luke Wright of Tennessee. It is therefore an ex-Confederate who now stands as the exponent of this government and this people in that great group of islands in the eastern seas over which the American flag floats. General Wright has taken a leading part in the work of steadily bringing order and peace out of the bloody chaos in which we found the islands. He is now taking a leading part not merely in upholding the honor of the flag by making it respected as the symbol of our power, but still more in upholding its honor by unwearied labor for the establishment of ordered liberty, of law-creating, law-abiding civil government under its folds. The progress which has been made under General Wright and those like him has been indeed marvelous. In fact, a letter of the general's the other day seemed to show that he considered there was far more warfare about the Philippines in this country than there was warfare in the Philippines themselves. It is an added proof of the completeness of the reunion of our country that one of the foremost men who have been instrumental in driving forward the great work for civilization and humanity in the Philippines has been a man who in the Civil War fought with distinction in a uniform of Confederate gray. If ever the need comes in the future, the past has been made abundantly evident, the fact that from this time on, Northerner and Southerner will in war know only the generous desire to strive how each can do the more effective service for the flag of our common country. The same thing is true in the endless work of peace, the never-ending work of building and keeping the marvelous fabric of our industrial prosperity. The upbuilding of any part of our country is a benefit to the whole, and every such effort as this to stimulate the resources and industry of our particular section is entitled to the heartiest support from every quarter of the Union. Thoroughly good national work can be done only if each of us works hard for himself and at the same time keeps constantly in mind that he must work in conjunction with others. You have made a particular effort in your exhibition to get in touch with the West Indies. This is wise. The events of the last 4 years have shown us that the West Indies and the Isthmus must in the future occupy a far larger place in our national policy than in the past. This is proved by the negotiations for the purchase of the Danish islands, the acquisition of Puerto Rico, the preparation for building an Isthmian canal, and finally by the changed relations which these years have produced between us and Cuba. As a nation, we have a special right to take honest pride in what we have done for Cuba. Our critics abroad and at home have insisted that we never intended to leave the island. But on the 20th of next month, Cuba becomes a free republic, and we turn over to the islanders the control of their own government. It would be very difficult to find a parallel in the conduct of any other great state that has occupied such a position as ours. We have kept our word and done our duty, just as an honest individual in private life keeps his word and does his duty. Be it remembered, moreover, that after our 4 years' occupation of the island, we turn it over to the Cubans in a better condition than it ever has been in all the centuries of Spanish rule. This has a direct bearing upon our own welfare. Cuba is so near to us that we can never be indifferent to misgovernment and disaster within its limits. The mere fact that our administration in the island has minimized the danger from the dreadful scourge of yellow fever, alike to Cuba and to ourselves, is sufficient to emphasize the community of interest between us. But there are other interests which bind us together. Cuba's position makes it necessary that her political relations with us should differ from her political relations with other powers. This fact has been formulated by us and accepted by the Cubans in the Platt Amendments. It follows as a corollary that where the Cubans have thus assumed a position of peculiar relationship to our political system, they must similarly stand in a peculiar relationship to our economic system. We have rightfully insisted upon Cuba adopting toward us an attitude differing politically from that she adopts towards any other power, and in return, as a matter of right, we must give to Cuba a different, that is, a better position economically in her relations with us than we give to other powers. This is the course dictated by sound policy, by a wise and far-sighted view of our own interest, and by the position we have taken during the past 4 years. We are a wealthy and powerful country dealing with a much weaker one. And this contrast in wealth and strength makes it all the more our duty to deal with Cuba as we have already dealt with her in a spirit of large generosity. This exposition is rendered possible because of the period of industrial prosperity through which we are passing. While material well-being is never all sufficient to the life of a nation, yet it is the merest truism to say that its absence means ruin. We need to build a higher life upon it as a foundation, but we can build little indeed unless this foundation of prosperity is deep and broad. The well-being which we are now enjoying can be secured only through general business prosperity, and such prosperity is conditioned upon the energy and hard work, the sanity and the mutual respect of all classes of capitalists, large and small, of wage workers of every degree, as is inevitable in a time of business prosperity. Some men succeed more than others, and it is unfortunately also inevitable that when this is the case, some unwise people are sure to try to appeal to the envy and jealousy of those who succeed least. It is a good thing when these appeals are made to remember that while it is difficult to increase prosperity by law, it is easy enough to ruin it, and that there is small satisfaction to the less prosperous if they succeed in overthrowing both the more prosperous and themselves in the crash of a common disaster. Every industrial exposition of this type necessarily calls up the thought of the complex social and economic questions which are involved in our present industrial system. Our astounding material prosperity, the sweep and rush rather than the mere march of our progress material development, have brought grave troubles in their train. We cannot afford to blink these troubles any more than because of them we can afford to accept as true the gloomy forebodings of the prophets of evil. There are great problems before us. They are not insoluble, but they can be solved only if we approach them in a spirit of resolute fearlessness, of common sense, and of honest intention to do fair and equal justice to all men alike. We are certain to fail if we adopt the policy of the demagogue who raves against the wealth which is simply the form of embodied thrift, foresight, and intelligence, who would shut the door of opportunity against those whose energy we should especially foster by penalizing the qualities which tell for success. Just as little can we afford to follow those who fear to recognize injustice and to endeavor to cut it out because the task is difficult, or even if performed by unskillful hands, dangerous. This is an era of great combinations, both of labor and of capital. In many ways, these combinations have worked for good, but they must work under the law, and the laws concerning them must be just and wise, or they will inevitably do evil. And this applies as much to the richest corporation as to the most powerful labor union. Our laws must be wise, sane, healthy, conceived in the spirit of those who scorn the mere agitator, the mere inciter of class or sectional hatred, who wish justice for all men, who recognize the need of adhering so far as possible to the old American doctrine of giving the widest possible scope for the free exercise of individual initiative, and yet who recognize also that after combinations have reached a certain stage, it is indispensable to the general welfare that the nation should exercise over them cautiously and with self-restraint, but firmly, the power of supervision and regulation. Above all, the administration of the government, the enforcement of the laws, must be fair and honest. The laws are not to be administered either in the interest of the poor man or the interest of the rich man. They are simply to be administered justly, in the interest of justice to each man, be he rich or be he poor, giving no immunity to no violator, whatever form the violation may assume. Such is the obligation which every public servant takes. To it he must be true under penalty of forfeiting the respect both of himself and of his fellows. And now, my fellow countrymen, in closing, I am going to paraphrase something said by Governor Aycock last night. I have dwelt today upon the fact that we are indeed a reunited people, that we are indeed and forever one people. The time was when one could not have made that statement with truth. Now it can be truthfully said. There was a time when it was necessary to keep saying it because it was already true and because the assertion made it more true. But the time is at hand. I think the time has come when it is not necessary to say it again. Proud of the South? Of course, we are proud of the South. Not only Southerners, but Northerners are proud of the South. Proud of your great deeds? Of course, I am proud of your great deeds, for you are my people. I thank you from my heart for the welcome you have given me, and I assure you that few experiences in my life have been more pleasant than the experiences of these last 2 days that I have spent among you. Theodore Roosevelt in Charleston, South Carolina, at the South Carolina Interstate and West Indies Exposition. Comments from a banquet the evening of April 8th, 1902, and the following day, April 9th, 1902, at the exposition itself. Thank you for joining us at Teddy Talks, 26 days with the 26th president. We're just getting started in the month of April. Tomorrow, April 9th, I wish I had my notes as to where we're going and what we're doing on April 9th. Stay tuned for an update both at Medora, ND, where we're going to put on some great shows this summer in Medora, North Dakota, or at Teddy Roosevelt Show. Happy 90th birthday, Brown Patterson. And thank you all for being here. Send your questions or comments. I'll respond to them as best I can. My apologies for the brief technical difficulties this morning. And bully for all of you at home. Stay safe. Call and write those you love. Make sure they're doing well. We'll get through this. And I'll see you tomorrow morning here at Teddy Talks. 26 days with the 26th president from Medora, North Dakota.